All right, so here we are, Geography 110, Lecture 6, Economic Geography. Today's topic, globalization of industry, production chains. Second lecture in our segment about industry, segment 2 here, part 2, whatever you want to call it. And today's lecture and, where are we, Thursday. Next Tuesday's lecture connect in important ways, so some of this will sort of continue on through. Now, what I talked about on Tuesday, really packing it in there, was basic industrial location, that industries have sites, that places they need to go. There's a logic to that, and there's dynamics to that as they build up places, and then there's a collective logic of how industry comes together in these clusters, these districts, and so on. So we zoom through that. So today we're talking about globalizing really long-distance production, production at a distance. Although that was such a clunky title, I thought it'd be sexier to call it globalizing production. You know, come on, you got to make compromises. So today's keys are, where's my outline? Hold on. Yeah, I usually like to show my outline first. So we'll talk about basically production chains and global production. I think I thought I changed that. Anyway, distribution system, then transport and communications. Okay? But going back, today's keys, industry is globalizing in new ways. And it's globalizing through production chains. And that's going to be first topic of discussion today, where you have industrial systems that are multi-part and multi-site that are spreading out around the world, that are being subcontracted around the world, being offshored from the U.S. and Europe. Now we're going to talk about distribution, which is a major economic activity in its own. Not get away from just talking about manufacturing and factories, but how things move around. So we'll start with that. A very simple, basic idea of how chains are linked up, sites of production are linked up by this distribution system, which has its own locational logic, and then its own management, or what's called logistics. Logistics is a very sexy topic in business, in economic geography in recent years. And then we'll finish with transport and communication systems, which are such a vital part, historically, the understanding of economic geography, and themselves subject to revolutions which are changing the world. Okay? So global production or global production chains, but that doesn't fit nicely. You can see transport and communication screws up my slides. It's too long. So global production, the first topic is production chains, then outsourcing. Well, I was going to take out subcontract. Anyway, outsourcing, contract manufacture, and the globalization of production chains. So let's start with what is a production chain. A production chain is a term you see a lot these days, is a multi-step system of production. Now, all production is multi-step. A Ford assembly plant is multi-step, but it tends to be in one assembly line in one factory. But here we're talking about even longer production system that cannot be contained generally within one factory. Yes, there's River Rouge. Remember, you go from steel to a car. That actually doesn't make a lot of sense. And it makes more sense to have a steel plant and a tire plant and a car parts plant and a car assembly plant. And that would be a chain of production, going from steel to auto bodies and engines to an assembly. Okay? That's the kind of thing we mean. And that would be, and there's serial production where you're taking one thing and processing it in several steps. And more commonly, component assembly systems like cars, where you have hundreds or even thousands of parts and you bring them together, put them all together in an assembly factory. That's just a simple way of dividing. Neither of those are pure terms, but we don't need to take too much time on that. So here's somebody's chart off the web. I was trying to find a good chart of this. So upstream, you would have, say, mining and refining and smelting of a metal. Midstream, semi-fabrication, casting, rolling, extrusions, getting metal pieces in usable sense. And then downstream, fabrication into actual, say, truck bodies or camper hoods or metal screen doors or whatever it is. So that's one advertiser, one company's attempt to sort of talk about a metal working series of production steps or a production system. Now, there are a lot of terms used for production chains, like production systems, commodity chains. Business press loves the term value chains, which is just confusing because we want to keep it. It's actually about making something in steps. Or we can also call it an internal division of labor within an industry. Okay. Now, if you have one product with many parts of the production series, that would lead to many workplaces, factories, workshops, whatever, which could lead very easily to many sites. Okay? And this is an important part of contemporary industrial geography. It's about these multi-sited industries. In the old days when Alfred Weber was writing, well, you knew what a steel mill was, and you just said, well, where's that going to locate? Okay? But now we know that industries have much more fragmented or divided up production systems, and we have to look at how those whole systems fit together and where they locate. It's very hard to get maps of this. The old, here's the steel industry, it's around Pittsburgh, or the Alleghenies, whatever, that you could map. It's much harder to map this. Here's one I grabbed about parts of a PC, I think it's PC production, yeah, for Bell, coming back into Austin, Texas here, and where you would get different parts of it. And a lot of the parts, of course, come from East Asia. Here we have video cards from Hong Kong. This may be a few years old. Floppy disk. Yeah, nobody does floppy disk. This is old. Malaysia, Singapore, disk devices, and SCSI cards. Yeah, this is 10 years old. Come on, I can't keep up on everything. Jesus Christ. Okay, Taiwan, monitors. Japan, RAM chips. France, soundboards. And China, power sources. Now notice how little came from China in those days. So this is at least 10 years old. Okay? But it's very hard to map this stuff because it's a very complex pattern. So when you say, well, where is the PC industry? It's all over the place. It's mostly trans-Pacific. That is, it mostly runs between East Asia and the Western U.S. But, of course, the Europeans also bring stuff in and assemble it in Ireland and so on. Oh, whoops. And these sites may sound like they're just one factory, but they may not be one factory. They actually may be a factory that is itself within a cluster. Now, clusters or industrial districts actually are divided up production systems. I didn't really call it that. I called it vertical disintegration. But that's what you're talking about, a divided up production system. Many firms doing many parts, but they are then in a cluster or a district, they're close to each other. Now we're talking about when it's spread across the world. And it can, even when it's spread across the world, if there's a disk drive cluster in Singapore, okay, the disk drive may come from a plant, but the plant is in a cluster. And it may end up going to another cluster, or let's say the flat screens are being made up in Korea. There may be a Korean cluster, flat screen production around, I don't know where that is in Korea. They do produce a lot of them, so maybe it's in Seoul, okay? So there might be a district, and this whole series may be drawing on different districts or drawing on isolated factories. So you can see the whole geography of it gets quite complicated. Okay, outsourcing. What is outsourcing? Outsourcing is buying a part or buying a component from somebody else. It is an organizational term referring to whether a company makes the thing within itself or buys the part from somebody else. And so there's off-the-shelf outsourcing. Just means when I go to the hardware store, I buy it off the shelf. I'm outsourcing. I'm not making a hammer by myself. I buy the hammer so I can go build a house. Say I'm a contractor, I'm a house builder. The product I'm building is a house. But the hammer I buy at the hardware store. But you can also, most industry does not do it that way. It contracts for its components. It contracts for drill presses or hammers, whatever it needs, or vehicles. When the auto leasing companies that you go to, or the auto rental companies like Enterprise or Hertz, they have contracts with car producers to bring in all these different cars that you will then lease. And that's a subcontracting arrangement. They don't go to car dealers and buy those cars. They have direct contracts with the auto companies, and that's called subcontracting. Now, some of it can be very formal contracts, but when you get into a place like Silicon Valley, where you're talking about maybe a one-off kind of machine that you need for your, say, inscribing your circuits or designing your circuits. Okay, you're going to get it from Silicon Graphics. You may not have even a written contract. You may have quite an informal contract about the design you want in that computerized design CAD/CAM system, and they'll produce it for you. And maybe at some point they'll come up with a fixed contract, maybe they won't. With a lot of smaller firms, there may be no formal contract at all. But all that's called subcontracting. And it has to do with a kind of ongoing relationship between companies, not just buying it off the supermarket shelf. IT, as you can see from this graphic here, has been the leading sector in outsourcing for the last 20, 30 years. But it's done by all kinds of industries. Now, subcontracting networks are systems of subcontracting, where you'll have, a lead firm, often called an original equipment manufacturer. That term is disappearing, but it's been used a lot. A lead firm, and then subcontractors that produce, say, these major components, and then they'll subcontract to other companies. Toyota System tends to have about 4 layers of subcontractors. And Toyota may contract for its engine blocks or its bodies, just the raw body. And it may not make those itself. It buys those from a subcontractor, or actual assemblies. Toyota may not make itself. In fact, no, it doesn't. It buys it from another company. But that company may need bearings. So they contract the bearings from a third company down the hierarchy. And in the case of something like car doors, there are contracts that go down all the way to somebody who makes the little plastic knob that goes on the car door handle, right? Toyota doesn't care about that. It's like 3, 4 levels down. It may be made in a workshop out in rural Japan by some farm, recently off the farm women who are working in a tiny workshop with small plastic cutting or plastic molding machines. You never know. And a lot of this stuff's very complicated, and I don't have a good diagram. Now, outsourcing and subcontracting often get confused. Outsourcing just means I get it from somebody else. A subcontract is a much more systematic relation. Now, most outsourcing in industrial production and production chains is subcontracted. That is, it has some kind of longer-term relation. It isn't just I go to market, buy my carrots, and leave. Even you don't do that. If you go to the supermarket, yeah. But even supermarkets, you tend to develop an affinity for a certain supermarket, right? You always go to Safeway, or you always go to Andronico's, or you only go to Berkeley Natural Foods. Or you go to the farmer's market where you develop a relationship with Happy Boy, and you get to know those people. That's like more like a subcontract. It's not a pure impersonal market relationship. And most market exchange is not purely impersonal. Okay, what's the logic of outsourcing? Well, there was a period in American industrial history where, in the middle of the 20th century, where corporations got bigger and bigger and tried to do more and more in-house, like River Rouge, but even at the level of the corporation, making more parts themselves. GM made Delco batteries. It also had Fisher Body, and it made a lot of the components itself. It never made tires, but it did make a lot of components. Over the last 25, 30 years, with the impact of global competition, the Japanese production system, which used much more outsourcing. Oh, there he goes. He's sleeping again. You in the plaid shirt. Wake up. Thank you. Sorry about that. But under the impact of the Toyota system, companies have gone much more to outsourcing, and they do it for several reasons. One is, this is actually a theoretical question that an economist in Chicago back in the 1930s or 40s posed, a guy named Ronald Coase, eventually got the Nobel Prize for this, is why do corporations do it in-house? Why don't they buy from somebody else? And he said, this is an economic question. Why to make or to buy? To do it in-house or to outsource? And it turns out that it isn't obvious why a company would do one or the other. And this, only in the last 25, 30 years, has this been taken seriously in economics as a problem. For a long time, it was thought, well, corporations could just get bigger and bigger. And we had theorists who analyzed the logic of why companies get bigger and bigger. But what's happened over the last quarter century is that companies have actually shed a lot of things. There's much more outsourcing today than there was 25 years ago. Part of the neoliberal period, part of the last period of capitalism and industrialization has been a revolution in outsourcing. More and more of this. And the reasons are, it's often more efficient. That is, is it efficient to buy tires if you're General Motors or make tires? Well, it turns out making tires is a completely different process with different technologies, different resources. It turns out it doesn't make that much sense to make tires in-house. And as Ford discovered with River Rouge, making steel is not something a car company ought to be doing. Steel companies should do it. So you're better off to outsource your steel. They're better at it. They're more efficient at it than you will ever be. And they're more efficient because they know what they're doing. They have that technological mastery. They have the skill, the workers, and they've got the equipment. So there's an analysis of what's called economies of scope or scale. And all scope means is the correct scale. It's just a different term for correct scale. Now, why have one steel plant make all the steel for all the car companies, plus for bridges and rebar and everything else? Because large scale works in steel industry. So you want to just pour that iron ore in and get those furnaces blasting and put out as much steel as you can. That's the way you get efficiency and economies of scale, right? Whereas one car company, I can't demand enough steel to make my own steel competitively with a steel industry, with a steel plant. Okay, that's the logic of that. But the logic can also apply to door handles. That why should I bother to make the door handles when perhaps a small workshop with specialized machinery and workers can do it better? Well, door handles are so simple, it's not a good example. But something like axles or ball bearings, which is a very specialized thing, maybe I can buy them from a company that produces ball bearings for a lot of companies. Not a big company, doesn't have a big factory, but it produces those ball bearings really well. Or what was the example I was giving the other day about those Japanese companies that make like disc drive motors? They do it really well at the right scale, and they can produce it for almost everybody. And it's just stupid for anyone else to bother to make them when you can buy them. Or so it seems. You can buy them from this one company in Japan, whatever it was called, Mabuchi, that does, look at that guy name. Mabuchi does it so well, okay? So that's economies of scope or economies of outsourcing. There are other reasons too. Sometimes you outsource because your demand is going up and down. So it's hard to build a factory at exactly the right scale. So when you get too much demand, you put out some of your work to somebody else. That's outsourcing too. And then when demand goes down, you pull that back in, and somebody else gets screwed, but you don't. You keep your workers in your factories occupied on the kind of base demand. And as we know, the economy is cyclic, so put out the extra work to somebody else. Okay? And for instance, if you were like a lumber mill, and you've got some guys who work for you, they're cutting timber. But now suddenly lumber demand goes up. You need some more timber coming into your mill. You will quickly subcontract with independent jippers who will go out and start cutting trees for you. Bring it in. And those guys, when demand goes down, those guys are maybe screwed, but they're great because they fill that kind of niche of on and off work. And the workers they hire on and off. You get a lot of this in resource industries, but you get in manufacturing too. Okay, and then, of course, a very big reason for outsourcing, which we'll talk about a lot more when we talk about labor and what's happened to labor, is to cut labor costs, to get cheaper labor. Your laborers work for GM for a long time. It's expensive. They have a big union contract with big benefits. So by putting out your parts to some other company, they don't have the union contract. They don't have the same labor costs. They're down in Kentucky. You're in Michigan. Michigan labor is more expensive than Kentucky labor. So you benefit from that. So that's a lot of this outsourcing. And of course, a big example would be like the university putting outsourcing bus drivers. Okay, they don't want to do it. They want cheaper labor. They do it to a bus company that doesn't have a union contract and hires cheaper, newer immigrant labor and can do it. And so the university gets cheaper costs. Of course, it screws their workers, but they're just a big employer. They don't care. They're trying to save money. They're in budget crisis. Food services is a classic. Custodial services, all the janitorial services, almost all big companies put it out now instead of doing it in-house and get it cheaper. And it's usually labor costs. Okay, so that was a graph of the growth of outsourcing in IT and in information technology in the 2000s, still going up. Okay, contract manufacture is a special kind of outsourcing. It's a very specific kind where you outsource not just this part and that part, but the whole manufacturing process. Now that's pretty weird, right? That's where the original equipment manufacturers are designing and marketing the product, but somebody else is making it. But this is typical of today's electronics. Apple doesn't actually make anything. They design it, they do this beautiful job, they'll design the engineering of it, the look of it, the software maybe for it, they'll patent the designs and they can put their name on it, and you buy it in an Apple store, but it's made by somebody else, probably Foxconn. Okay? So beyond inputs into components, you can get sub-assemblies, but even whole products. This is a graph of the growth of contract manufacturing in billions from 1990 to 2000. It just shot up in the 2000s. And this is a kind of a graphic that shows you what I'm talking about. The traditional manufacturing firm, including Apple, up until the 1990s, did everything and made its own products. But what you do now is you are the market outlet, you design, then you contract with somebody else to make it. Oh, whoops, this goes backwards. The brand name firm contracts with a contract manufacturer to make it. This is really bad. No, it doesn't work that way. No, this is so bad. I gotta get rid of this graph. Anyway, Apple sells it, they design it, but somebody else builds it for. And then that contract manufacturer, they will probably subcontract components. Just what I was talking about already. Okay, yeah, here lead firms or OEMs will do R&D, design, specs, branding, marketing, distribution. And then the contract manufacturer will build it, but they'll also design a lot of the manufacturing process, and even they'll design some of the parts. They'll usually work very closely with the final firm, the lead firm, to get that right. And some lead firms are highly specify everything, like Apple, and others go, okay, you do it, just give me that final product. Yeah.
I guess to me, it's a little bit clearer how material products is more efficient in contracting. I was wondering if you go back a little bit and explain what makes something like janitorial service more efficient to go through a company that has a is it doing the benefits?
It's not more efficient. I said efficiency is one reason, but just cheaper labor is another reason. And a lot of it's just for cheapness. So a lot of them they're under a competitive pressure and they just shed labor and shed union contracts. A good example was when Safeway, a contract that had a big warehouse in Richmond that was all unionized. When Safeway ran into trouble in the late 80s, early 90s, they subcontracted to a new firm that did their warehousing out of Tracy, in a huge warehouse out there that doesn't officially belong to Safeway. And that broke the union contract. But it was both a new plant, a new warehouse that was more efficient and bigger, better situated in many ways, but also a subcontracting firm that didn't have union contracts. And the biggest ones today are these Taiwanese ones, particularly Foxconn, or Hon Hai, which is a subsidiary of Hon Hai, which peaked at 800,000 workers in the mid-2000s. That's one big company all over the world. And I told you they had this factory complex around Shenzhen that had 270,000 workers. However, I said it made shoes. That's another factory complex. I think it's in Dongguan. And I think it's Foxconn or maybe somebody else. But that one in Shenzhen that I showed you a picture of actually makes iPods and video game consoles and that sort of thing. So pardon me. The three biggest companies in the 90s were American company, Flextronics, Selectron, and Sanmina SCI. And as late as 2003, they ranked 1, 2, 4, with Foxconn at 3. But now Foxconn and some of these other Chinese and Taiwanese ones are higher in the list, and the American ones have fallen. But it is important, I think, that the big three, the biggest amount of subcontracting in the world or the leading industry in subcontracting was IT, electronics. They were also the leaders in contract manufacturing, putting their stuff out. Apple was actually the last company that tried to keep it in-house, and it almost busted them in the 90s. And I think when Steve Jobs took it back over in 96, 97 is when they closed down their own manufacturing plants and started putting it out to Asia like everybody else. But when you say they put it out to Asia, at first they simply put it out to the guys down the street. Selectron, Flextronics, and Sanmina SCI. And they then put it out to Asia. That is, they had the contract. Are you listening to me or are you just looking at that screen? Okay. I know it's not always the most exciting. I think it's exciting. I know you don't think it's exciting all the time, but it has its moments. Okay, but contract manufacturing isn't all in China, despite the Foxconn example. In fact, Foxconn itself is all